What happened 72 years ago? The entire world shifted into a new era. History changed. The trajectory of Jewish history, and of course of human history, was irrevocably altered. We feel it, we sense it. The Gemara in Shabbos, Rava claims that when a person ascends to Shemayim and faces his ultimate din v'cheshbon, every person will have to face some basic questions from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Were you involved in a moral and ethical lifestyle? Did you dedicate time for Torah study? Did you invest massively in raising your children? Asakta b'pira v'irvia? But one of the questions, and part of Jewish identity, part of Frumkeit, is tzipisa Yeshua. Did you live in your world, embrace it, advance it, embed yourself in it, but did you accept it as the only reality? Or did you live in this reality, but imagine a different one? Did you split your vision, split your imagination, realizing that you live in a certain world, but you're promised a different world? You live in one place, but you belong in another place. Can you pull off that bifurcation? Can you live two lives without it becoming schizophrenic, living a life in which you embrace, but you also dream of something else? And Jews have always dreamed. And finally, the dreams started to materialize. So one of the questions is tzipisa Yeshua. For 2,000 years, tzipisa Yeshua meant waiting with stamina, with belief, with prayer, with mitzvahs, knowing that every mitzvah contributed to a redemptive arc, to a redemptive process. But essentially, we're pawns of history. We had no historical empowerment, so we just waited. Now it's a different era. And when we ascend to Shemayim Ad Mea V'Esrim, the question of tzipisa Yeshua isn't just did you wait, but did you sense HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence in history? Did you contribute to that? Did you advance the process? Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu has emboldened us with tools. We're now partners in the process. We're not just waiting to be the beneficiaries, but the process has begun. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu expects us to be authors. For 2,000 years, Jewish life was so rich and deep. And we built communities. And Torah flourished. And we built Torah. And we built Jewish identity. And Jewish culture emerged. But something was always missing. We always had that fragility. No matter how comfortable we were, it was transient, it was passing. Whether it was Spain, or Poland, or Baghdad, Jews knew that they were visitors, they were guests. It's amazing what we built as guests, but we lived at the mercy. We lived at the mercy of our hosts, and we lived at the mercy of events we couldn't control. And sadly enough, throughout history, we suffer the tragedy of not possessing sovereignty and not being able to defend ourselves. And of course, it was punctuated by the Holocaust, the single greatest chilul Hashem since we were expelled from Yerushalayim, the systematic attempt to eliminate Jews, not just from Europe. Hitler had blueprints of synagogues from New York City found in his bunker. He actually had a list of 200 Albanian Jews. That's how systematic and how obsessed he was with exterminating our people. And that all changed. And before we think on this day about all the messianic potential and all the excitement that this day brings and this day promises, just remember how much we needed a home and how much we needed security. Shuvi nafshi limnuchaychi ki Hashem gamal alaychi. Minucha means many things. It has a spiritual connotation, but it primarily means a place of peace, of serenity, of stability, and not just a home and freedom, but the pride and the identity that comes with knowing you are at home. And even if you don't live in the state of Israel, knowing that you have a home, that your family lives in that home, that that home is waiting for you and beckons you. Shuvi nafshi limnuchayche, when we recite those words, think about all the Holocaust survivors who were ported from country to country. No country was willing to take them in. And then finally, in 1948, Shuvi nafshi limnuchayche. But it's not just a place and a home, it's also the pride, the identity that minuchasi, that minuchaychi possesses and provides, the komemius li'artzenu. The Jewish world has made such impressive advances over the last 80 years at a communal level, and this is a shiur being circulated by the OU, and they play such an important role in North American, primarily across the world as well, communal identity and communal stability and community development. but not just in communities, the Torah that we've built, the palaces of Torah, the yeshiva world, the learning, the growth, the influence, the political. Look at what we've developed. Very little of this would have been possible without Komemius. If there are people living, learning, growing, it's because deep in our subconscious, in the Jewish subconscious, we walk with greater pride. And when we walk with greater pride, and with greater komemius, upright, rather than bent over, proud to wear a kippot in public, proud to be identified as Jews, proud to have an identity. For the first time in 2,000 years, that pride isn't being met with anger and with hostility, and it's felt deeply by everyone in our people. All that would not have been possible. I remember my Zaidi told me a story that when he was walking home from shul as a youngster in White Russia, as a bar mitzvah boy, he was accosted by a Russian soldier who told him, "You have 20 minutes to go home and say goodbye to your parents and pack your belongings. I am requisitioning you into the Russian army." It was World War I. It wasn't anti-Semitic, he just needed a weapons bearer. "If you're not back in 20 minutes, I'll hunt you down and I'll murder you and your entire family." I remember asking my Zaidi, "What did you do?" And he looked at me and he took my hand in his hand and he said, "Meshala." My name was Moshe, but he called me Meshala, Litvak. He said, "What could I do?" I ran home, collected my tefillin, and ran back because I didn't want my family to be butchered. I lived haunted by that story of my 13-year-old grandfather fleeing from drunk Russian soldiers across frozen tundras in Russia. The second year after I made Aliyah, I was returning home on Hanukkah, the night we celebrate, the Chag we celebrate, Jewish sovereignty. Komemius, Malchus Yisrael, even though it's a pale, pale image of the Malchus Yisrael we hope for and we yearn for. I was driving through Beit Lechem, there was no bypass road, and I saw a policewoman in my rear view mirror, and she pulled me aside, she pulled me over, and she told me that I was speeding, and she wrote a ticket. And as she was writing a ticket, I started crying. I said, my grandfather lived in abject fear of drunk Russian officers, and here I am receiving a traffic ticket from my own policewoman, who is probably on her way home to light her own Hanukkah candles, because every Jew in Israel, Dati and not Dati, and those are very, very loose labels. Every Jew in Israel lights candles. Every Jew in Israel has a Seder, and the Seder was very, very poignant this year. Obviously, the mass Starim, some had Starim on Zoom, those who don't keep classic halacha. And I said, what a schus it is, not to get traffic tickets, but to live in my country with my police and my soldiers. Do you know what your grandparents would do if they saw a Jewish soldier, even without a kippah on? Kal v'chomer, certainly if they saw a Hesder boy with his tzitzis out and his kippah on, holding a Mishnah in his back pocket, they would start crying. And they probably won't stop crying until Rosh Hashanah, because for thousands of years, soldiers represented fear, terror, rape, butchering, murder with impunity. Jews were just at the full caprice of soldiers marching through town, stealing their food, quartering themselves in their homes, and taking advantage of them in so many different ways. So we thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Shuvi nafshi limnuchaychi. We thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Ki Hashem gamal alaychi. We thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The ability to thank Hashem and to see the hand of the Rabbonu Shalom in history. Not just in nature, not just in His Torah, although primarily not just in mitzvos, but to see the Yad Hashem in history and to be thankful for the great Nisim. We don't understand the Holocaust, but we certainly want to thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the great Nisim in allowing our people to reconstitute themselves in the wake of that tragedy and to rebuild our people in Eretz Yisrael and to have that reconstruction project radiate out from the Komemius we feel in Eretz Yisrael. But we also want to thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu, not just for ourselves, but we want to thank Him for Him. Why do we want to thank Him for Him? We say in our davening every day, Niran Nabi Shu Asecha, V'Shem Elokeinu Nidgol. Nabi Shu Asecha, we want to celebrate your salvation. It's not your salvation, Hashem, that we wait for. It's our salvation, our redemption, our liberation. Nabi Shu Asenu. Why do we recite Nabi Shu Asecha? The answer is because we are His ambassadors. We represent Hashem in this world. We always have. Ger Yazaracha Be'eretz Lalahem. The second that Jews were given their mission to represent their Rabbonu Shalom, to represent Hashem Echad U'Shmo Echad, to represent the moral essence of Kudsha B'Richu. From the moment we were missioned, we were hated for it because we challenged the world, and people don't like to be challenged. And as part of the hatred directed towards us, and as part of our own internal failures, the ego, the meraglim, our disloyalty during the Beis HaMikdash, primarily the first Beis HaMikdash, we suffered, we wandered the sands of time, we wandered through exile. Jewish plight was deplorable. The Jewish situation was sad and gloomy. But when Jews suffer, we're not the only ones who suffer. HaKadosh Baruch Hu suffers. HaKadosh Baruch Hu suffers for two reasons. First of all, because even though HaKadosh Baruch Hu is infinite and beyond time, beyond place, certainly beyond events in this world, but his Shekhinah and the struggle to bring his presence into this world regresses when Jewish people suffer. The arc of Jewish people is really the trajectory of Hashem's Shekhinah. When we rise, his presence augments, and when we fall and when we decline, his presence recedes and diminishes. So for 2,000 years, it was so difficult to find the Yad Hashem to an average bystander. If you're in the Beis Medrash, where you were holding a lulav, you were accessing HaKadosh Baruch Hu through some timeless route that had no need for external framing or external ratification or justification. But we're not just interested in Hashem's presence being expressed to those who can intuit him in a lulav or a matzah or a blot gemara. We want the world to see, V'hai Hashem lemelech al kol haaretz, v'yeda kol pol ki ata pialto, v'yavin kol yitzor ki ata yitzarto. We want every, v'yoma kol asher neshama be'apo, anyone who breathes, and right now we're trying to struggle to breathe, and our breathing is dangerous, and kol asher neshama be'apo, ruach hapeinu, Mashiach Hashem, the air of our nostrils, should bring Mashiach in a literal sense. Pasuk in Eicha, ruach hapecha, ruach hapeinu, Mashiach Hashem. So for 2,000 years, the Shekhinah was hidden, was obscured, and the Shekhinah suffered. Shechinta begalusa. The Shekhinah was suffering with us. Again, the Shekhinah meaning Hashem's presence, the palpability, the noticeability of Hashem in our world. And Hashem was sad because his children were suffering. And when we davened, he davened. And when we were misabel, he was misabel on a father that had to expel his children. And then that changed. In 1948, that Chilul Hashem of 2,000 years of absence and obscurity and concealment of Hashem and sadness, all of a sudden a great, great Kiddush Hashem, our state, our people, and what a state, and what phenomenal accomplishments spiritually, the pride that people feel in our country. It's not perfect, it's not pure, it's not flawless, but Hashem's presence is far, far more palpable in 2020 than it was in 1920, not to mention 1940. So when we say Hallel, Lo lanu Hashem lo lanu, ki im l'shimcha tein kavod. We're happy on this day, not just because of everything that we've benefited from in our home, and our freedom, and our sovereignty, and our pride, and our horizons, and our hope, but we're happy for you. Lo lanu Hashem lo lanu, ki im l'shimcha tein kavod. We are here living in our state and living in a world with a state to bring glory to you, to draw you into this world so that people will sense you, so that we're closer to Malchus Hashem. The same words that Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah recited according to the Gemara Pesachim when they were about to be flung into the Kivshan age. We don't care whether we live or die. It's not important. But for you, this is a seam of history. It's a very delicate point of history. And Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the Beis HaMikdash. People were doubting, were the Jews chosen? Does Hashem still care? Hashem, if you make a statement. I think about Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah in 1945. Hashem had to make a statement. We don't know why the Holocaust in the state of Israel, but clearly the Holocaust represented a Chilul Hashem of unparalleled proportions, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to create an event that would restore some semblance, some proportion of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's renewed presence in our world. I told the story before about my grandfather. I remember about 15 years ago, 20 years ago now, there was a commemoration ceremony for the liberation of Auschwitz, and Jews were gathering from across the world to visit those train tracks that had witnessed such death and horror. And the Jewish Israel requested a flyover, that the Israeli jets should fly over the train tracks. And initially the Polish parliament buckled and they refused. And then a few weeks later, the Polish army invited the Israeli Air Force to participate in war games. And the squadron commander of the Israeli Air Force unit, who was a Sephardi Jew, who wasn't even, his family wasn't imperiled by the Holocaust, said, Jewish jets will only fly in Radan, which was the Polish city where the air games and war games were about to take place, if they first fly in Auschwitz. And of course, the Polish parliament conceded. I remember that day as a convocation of Jewish leaders gathered and hoisted flags and sang Hatikva across those horrible, horrible train tracks. He pulled his team into formation in the skies above, and he announced over his radio, Gicha Achat Avor Am Yisrael, one flight for the Jewish people. Gicha in Hebrew means a sortie or a flyover. Gicha Achat Avor Eretz Yisrael, one flight for the land of Israel. Gicha Achat Avor Korbanot HaShoah, one flight for Holocaust victims. And he swooped down over those tracks. And I remember thinking to myself, in 1944, in the summer of 1944, how desperate were we for that one flight? How desperately did we plead with Roosevelt and Churchill and Eisenhower for one uncontested bombing mission over the train tracks from Budapest to Auschwitz? 1944 could have saved 750,000 Jewish lives. We're looking at the numbers in the pandemic. 750,000 Jews were killed from Budapest and Hungary. In the latter stages of the war, the skies of Europe were in complete Allied control. The Luftwaffe had been decimated. How many bombing missions were conducted? And yet 750,000 Jewish lives were not worth one uncontested bombing mission. And we didn't have that flight. And I can't imagine a Chilul Hashem greater than that. And now it was about 60 years later. And now we had our flight and we had our Air Force. And I felt as if I was living through a Kiddush Hashem. Va'as leman shmei. Hashem did it not just for our sake as well, but for His sake. And let's celebrate Va'as leman shmei. Let's celebrate the refreshed presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in our world. That's what changed. We benefited, but we also were we weren't the only beneficiaries. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as it were, benefited. And then, of course, it's not just what happened, but what we expect to happen. We expect this to be part of a process. No one can tell you how long the process will take. No one can prophesize the quality, the texture of the process. But we know it's a process. We know that events that have started are irreversible. And that even though the process of redemption is a long process, these 2,000 years, as I mentioned before, mitzvos and tefillah and zechuyos, but now we're empowered to take real concrete actions, building buildings, building a country, building our peoplehood, building our identity, building our culture in ways which will directly, in a human realm, every tefillah, every mitzvah counts, but in a human realm we'll be able to trace our efforts to the conclusive and concluding chapters of history. We don't know anything other than how it will end, where it will end. We don't know who will carry history to its conclusion. We certainly don't know how quickly it will be, the caliber. These are experiences which are larger than the human imagination. We're living through a pandemic which reminds us of the limits of human imagination and how there are experiences which are too large for us. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu reminded our Nevi'im twice that when you start to think about Geula, realize you're entering a world that's larger. That's beyond human ration, beyond human decipherability. Kadosh Baruch Hu tells Yirmiyah in Perek Lamed Beis, Hayipale mimeni kol davar. Yirmiyah questions whether Hashem will rebuild Yerushalayim because he's living in the walls that are falling apart and the city's on fire. Hashem says, Hamimeni yipale kol davar. Buy the land in Yerushalayim. Hashem tells Yirmiyah. Yirmiyah purchased land as a symbol, as an omen for reconstitution. Yirmiyah would have been a very, very rich person today had he kept the deed to the land he bought from Baruch ben Neriah. In addition, HaKadosh Baruch Hu reminded Zechariah, very famous lines, Od yeshvu zakenim u'zakenos berchovos Yushalayim. Older people once again walk through Yushalayim. We all know that beautiful, beautiful prophecy. And then the next pasuk in Zechariah says, Ki yipalei be'enei she'eres ha'am hazeh. People who will live and see the end of time will be shocked. Gam be'ena yipalei. I'll also be shocked, Hashem says, Kivayachal. So twice Hashem reminds us of the Pella, of the mysteries. Is Geula unfolding the way we would expect it? If I was scripting Geula, wouldn't the state be wouldn't there be less enemies? Wouldn't the moral texture of our country be different? Of course. But that's the point. Geula is irrational. Geula is beyond human comprehension. It's specifically the irrationality of redemption that renders it redemptive. We try to change our world and fix our world and repair our world as best we can. But when we can't and when we fall up short, and we always fall up short, HaKadosh Baruch Hu descends into history and redeems our world for us in ways that we can't understand. So Geula never makes sense. That's what makes it redemptive, and that's what makes it so hard for people to appreciate and understand Geula. Shulchan Aruch is much simpler. Psak halacha, not simple, but it's rational. It's map, it's categories. Siman, sif. How large should the lulav be? How much matzah should you eat? How black should the tefillin be? It's ration-based. Geula, it's about the Jewish soul. It's about knowing you come from somewhere else. You come from a different time, from a different era. You're a foreigner. You're ger yazaracha, ger v'toshav. Just because you're a foreigner doesn't mean you live in fear. Doesn't mean you don't invest in your world. But we belong somewhere else, and we sense in our heart that draw. Who hasn't been to Israel and sensed, this is my place. These are my people. This is my future. So when we say not just Lo Lanu Hashem Lo Lanu, to thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for restoring the glory of His name, and when we say Shuvi Nafshi Limnu Chaychi, but when we say Me'es Hashem Haisazos, this came from the Rabbanu Shalom, He Niflaos B'Einenu, to us it's shocking. That's not the way we would have expected it to happen. We wouldn't have expected it to happen 3 years after the Holocaust. We wouldn't have expected it to happen facing so many enemies. We wouldn't have expected it to happen being driven in a secular manner. None of these are what we would have expected. But that doesn't make this event and our state and this process any less Yad Hashem and any less redemptive. So I want to wish everyone a Chag HaAtzmaut, a Yom HaAtzmaut Sameach. It's a lot to think about, a lot to be thankful to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We don't know where all this pandemic is landing, but hopefully the Jewish people and the Jewish state will continue to take the lead in healing the world. But we know, of course, that as much as we try and as much as we'll develop vaccines, as much as we hope that some of it will come from Israel, Meretz Hashem, full healing can only be delivered by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. When the world is healed, not just medically, not just economically, not just politically, but spiritually, presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is apparent to all. In that world, man will be healed, the world will be perfected, and we will say, Hodu Ladonai Ki Tov, Ki Le'olam Chazdo. Yom HaAtzmaut Sameach to everyone.